In the summer of 1879, a Creek elder at the Muskogee Nation in Indian Territory agreed to describe, for the first time since the removal 43 years earlier, the specific cave systems along the Coosa River in northwest Georgia that his people had used as the material foundation of their medicine-keeping tradition. He was in his late 60s, which placed his birth in the years when the Creek still held their Georgia homelands, when he had been a young apprentice in the medicine tradition and had been inside the caves himself. He had refused a similar conversation at least twice with different Bureau of American Ethnology fieldworkers in 1873 and 1876, giving each time what the Bay correspondents described as a polite but firm unwillingness to discuss the subject of sacred geography in the old country. He agreed in 1879 to a different ethnologist. I will call him Dr. A. F., because his name is identifiable in the Smithsonian Archive and his family is reachable. And, he agreed, the private field notes record because of a calculation he had been making for several years and had finally resolved. The medicine tradition that required the caves was failing. Not because the people had abandoned it, but because the tradition was embodied in knowledge encoded in specific physical places in Georgia, and the people were in Oklahoma, and no one under 60 had ever been inside those places, and the oldest keepers were dying. The elder had decided that a written account held in Washington was better than no account at all. He had been wrong about this once before, he told Dr. A. F. He was not sure he was right now. But he was going to describe the caves anyway, because the alternative was silence, and silence was no longer protecting anything. I found this through a footnote in a published ethnological bibliography from 1952, a catalog of Bay fieldwork reports from the southern states, compiled by a Smithsonian archivist who had worked through the Creek correspondence files and noted, in a single-line entry for the 1879 fieldwork, field notes include extended account of sacred geography, old country, specific cave locations described. See private notebook, not included in official report. Private notebook, not included in official report. That notation led me to the Smithsonian Manuscript Division, to a folder in the personal papers of the ethnologist in question, to 83 handwritten pages that had been there since 1881, when the ethnologist donated his field materials to the institution. The first 51 pages are language notes, vocabulary, grammar, ceremonial terminology. Pages 52 through 83 are the elder's account of the caves. I read them in the Smithsonian Reading Room over 2 days in 2021. No one had cited them in anything I could find. By the time we reach the end of this, you will understand what the caves held and why they held it. Why the medicine notation system carved into their walls was the tradition's safeguard against exactly the kind of loss the removal caused, and why a Georgia State Geological Survey published in 1884 contains, in a supplementary appendix that was not included in the printed report, a description of cave wall markings in a northwest Georgia cave system that matches, with a precision that I have not been able to account for by coincidence, what the elder described to Dr. A. F. in 1879. Those two documents have been in different archives in different states for 140 years. They have not been compared. I want to be honest about what I can establish. I cannot tell you the current condition of the caves or whether the medicine notation system on their walls has been preserved or damaged in the period since 1884. What I can tell you is what the two documents independently describe and what their correspondence means for understanding what was in those caves and what was lost, or what may not yet be lost, when the Creek were removed from Georgia in 1836. The Creek medicine tradition, the medicine keeper's practice, separate from the broader ceremonial life of the green corn ceremony and the town square ground rituals, was a specialized discipline maintained by specific trained individuals whose authority came from their knowledge of specific substances, specific preparations, and specific ceremonial sequences that required both the knowledge and the material. The medicine keeper was not a general practitioner. The knowledge was narrow, deep, and specific to a lineage of transmission. A keeper learned from the keeper before them and transmitted to the keeper after, in a chain that extended back as far as the tradition's memory reached. The knowledge was transmitted orally, but oral transmission has a specific weakness that the Creek medicine keepers had evidently spent generations working around. It requires the presence of both the transmitter and the recipient. Requires both to survive to the moment of transmission, and requires that transmission to be completed before either one dies. The Creek had known for as long as they had the medicine tradition that these conditions were not guaranteed. They had devised a backup. The material, specific plants, specific minerals, specific fire compositions, was preserved in conditions that the medicine keepers had identified over generations as optimal, stable, cool temperature, consistent humidity, darkness, and the specific limestone chemistry that slowed the decomposition of organic material to a rate the tradition could manage. In the cave systems of the Coosa River Valley in northwest Georgia, those conditions existed naturally. The caves were not random shelters. They were selected over many generations for specific environmental qualities and maintained for specific preservation purposes. They were, in the tradition's own terms, medicine houses, the places where the tradition kept what the tradition could not afford to lose. Consider what the elders said was in the caves. The private notebook records his account in 3 sessions conducted over 4 days, with the third day's session being the longest and the one in which he described what he called the marked walls. He used a Muskogee term that Dr. A.F. translates as the keeper's writing, a system of incised and pigmented marks on the cave walls, applied by medicine keepers over many generations, encoding in a visual notation the sequence and composition of specific ceremonial preparations. Not decorative marks, not commemorative marks, functional ones, the equivalent, in the tradition's terms, of a pharmacological reference carved into a permanent surface, because the keeper's memory was finite, because keepers died, and their apprentices sometimes died before the full transmission was complete, and because certain knowledge, if lost, would leave the tradition unable to perform specific ceremonies that it had no other means of reconstructing. The cave wall, unlike any individual keeper, would outlast the disruptions that history consistently produced. That was the design intention. The marks were the tradition's insurance against transmission failure. The elder described their general character in terms that Dr. A.F. recorded carefully: geometric forms with specific relational positions, arranged in sequence along specific wall surfaces at specific heights, the sequence corresponding to the sequence of the ceremonial preparation the marks encoded, readable to someone trained in the notation, but not random to an untrained eye either. They had a structure that was visible even to someone who did not know what they meant. He described which wall surfaces, in which chambers carried which kinds of marks. He described the pigments used, some incised only, some incised and then filled with pigment of specific colors whose composition he described. He described the approximate vertical extent of the marked sections and the approximate distance between the sequences. He was working from a 43-year-old memory of a cave he had entered as a young apprentice, and the description is specific enough that I have not been able to explain its specificity except as accurate recall. This is the part I keep returning to, because the Creek medicine keepers who carved those marks into the Georgia limestone understood something that the removal proved they were right about: that human chains of transmission are vulnerable in ways that stone walls are not. They were designing for exactly the catastrophe that occurred. A forced removal that separated the people from the places would break the oral transmission. 43 years later, the elder was describing caves he had not entered since his 20s. To a stranger he was not sure would understand what he was giving him. But the walls would still have the marks. The marks would still be legible if someone who knew how to read them went back. The design worked for its intended purpose. The problem was the 43 years between the removal and anyone going back to look. The Spanish colonial record provides the earliest non-Creek documentation of these caves. The Hernando de Soto expedition passed through the Coosa River Valley in 1540, and the campaign's chronicler Rodrigo Rangel recorded in his narrative, published in the 19th century by a Spanish historian and translated in the 20th, that in a principal town on the Coosa, the expedition's commanders were shown underground places of ceremony in the limestone hills of the valley, which the people maintained as sacred and would not permit the Spanish to enter. Underground places of ceremony. Not permitted. The specific location Rangel describes in his narrative corresponds, in the geographic terms he uses, the river bend, the direction of the hills, the proximity to the principal town, to the area of northwest Georgia that the elder identified to Dr. A. F. 339 years later. The connection between those two accounts had not been noted before I placed them next to each other, because Rangel's narrative is most frequently cited in historical literature on the De Soto expedition's route and not cross-referenced against Bay fieldwork from Indian Territory. The Georgia Land Survey of 1832 is the document that records the transition between Creek custody of the caves and whatever came after. The Georgia legislature passed the Indian Land Lottery Act that year, dividing the ceded Creek territory into lottery districts to be distributed by draw to white Georgia citizens. The surveyors who laid out the lottery districts were working fast and under political pressure. Their notes are terse and geographic rather than descriptive. But in the notes for what became Lot 243 of the 15th District of what is now Murray County, the surveyor recorded, in a notation that appears to be his entire description of the relevant land, rocky hills with cave openings, one large. Indian marks inside on the walls. Good limestone. Indian marks inside on the walls. That is the full description. The lot was assigned in the 1832 lottery draw to a settler family. The cave became private property. The marks on the walls became features of a private property holder's limestone hills, described by the previous occupant's surveyor in 5 words, and then not described in any official document for 52 years. The Georgia State Geological Survey of 1884 sent survey teams through the northwest Georgia cave systems as part of a broader natural resources assessment. The published report notes several cave systems of commercial or geological interest. In the supplementary field notes, deposited with the Georgia Department of Natural Resources and available at the Georgia Archives in Morrow, though not digitized, the lead surveyor for the Murray County section describes the main chamber of the largest accessible cave system on a property in the 15th District as containing extensive markings on the limestone walls, appearing to be incised and in some areas pigmented, of a geometric character arranged in sequences along the south and east faces of the main chamber, the character and purpose of which are unknown to this survey, but which appear to have been applied over a considerable period. Incised, pigmented, geometric sequences. A considerable period of application. This is in a supplementary field note that was not included in the published geological survey, because the published survey concerned mineral and commercial resources, and the wall markings were neither. The supplementary note was filed with the department, held in the archive, and has been there since 1884 in a collection that concerns geological survey materials and is not typically searched by researchers working on creek removal history, bay fieldwork, or southeastern indigenous archaeology. The elder in 1879 described geometric marks applied in sequences along specific wall surfaces. The Georgia Geological Survey in 1884 described geometric marks applied in sequences along specific wall surfaces. The elder had been removed from Georgia in 1836, 48 years before the survey, 43 before he spoke. He described from memory what the survey independently found. And the two documents, separated by 5 years and the full width of the American South, have never been in the same analysis. The Georgia Historical Society contacted the Smithsonian in 1886, having received a partial summary of the Bay fieldwork from the previous decade. The Society's letter, in the Bay Administrative Correspondence at the Smithsonian, asks for clarification on the cave locations described in Creek fieldwork from Indian Territory, noting that a private landowner in the relevant district has contacted the Society regarding markings of possible Indian origin on the walls of a cave on his property, and the Society wishes to determine whether any existing documentation may be relevant. The landowner's accompanying note, which the Society had forwarded, describes the markings in terms that are consistent with what the elder and the Geological Survey had each independently described: geometric marks in sequence, incised and in places colored, on the south-facing walls of the main chamber. He says he has owned the property for 11 years, that his family bought it in the 1832 land lottery, and that the marks have always been there, and that he always assumed they were Indian markings, but has never known from which tribe or what they meant. He is asking the Georgia Historical Society, and the Society is asking the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian's response, if one was sent, is not in the Georgia Historical Society's archive. What is in that archive is the Society's letter, dated 1886, sitting next to the landowner's note, which together constitute the moment at which the circuit almost closed, at which the marked walls and the knowledge of what they encoded were within one institutional exchange of reaching each other. The exchange did not happen. The Smithsonian did not connect the Georgia inquiry to the 1879 notebook. The Society did not receive an answer. The landowner went on not knowing what was on his cave walls, and the elder who had described those walls in 1879, when the Society was writing its letter, was 7 years dead. The wider context includes the Cherokee, who share the regional territory and whose ceremonial cave traditions in the same limestone formations of northwest Georgia and the adjacent Appalachian foothills were documented in separate Bay fieldwork in the 1880s. Documentation that similarly records elders describing specific cave sites in the old country from memory, similarly noting that the marks on the walls encoded ceremonial knowledge, similarly acknowledging that the people who could read those marks had not been to Georgia since the removal of 1838. The parallel between the Creek and Cherokee accounts, both from Indian Territory, both from elders describing the same northwest Georgia limestone formations from memories that were 40-plus years old by the time the Bay asked, is not a coincidence of documentation. It is the record of two peoples who had made the same design decision: encode the critical knowledge in the walls of the caves because the walls would outlast the people, and who had both found by the 1870s and 1880s that the design had worked in the way that made it most heartbreaking. The walls were intact. The marks were there. The people who could read them were 3 states away. What the removal took from the Creek was not only the land, it took the ability to complete the circuit, to go back to the marked walls, to read the keeper's writing, to restore the ceremonial knowledge that the marks had been designed to preserve against exactly this kind of interruption. The design was correct. The marks were made for this. They survived. The people survived. What did not survive intact was the connection between the surviving marks and the surviving people, because 43 years of separation is long enough for the apprentices who knew the notation to age past the ability to travel back to Georgia and long enough for their own apprentices to grow up without ever having entered the cave. The cave in Murray County is still there. The marks are still there, or were in 1884, and there is no documented reason to believe they were destroyed in the period since private landowners in rural northwest Georgia have limited reason to excavate their own cave walls. The elders' account of what the marks encode is in Washington. The Geological Survey's description of the marks is in Morro. The Spanish colonial account of the cave's sacred character is in a 19th century published chronicle. The 1832 lot survey note is in the Georgia Archives under Lottery District Land Records. And the Georgia Historical Society's unanswered 1886 inquiry sits in their archive, noting that someone had come forward with the marks and asked if anyone knew what they were. Someone did know. He spoke in 1879. He spoke because silence was no longer protecting anything, and because the alternative was for the marks to mean nothing to anyone, forever. The circuit he was trying to complete in 1879 by handing the account to Dr. A. F. and trusting it to Washington is still incomplete. The account is in Washington. The marks are in Murray County. They have not yet been in the same room. If this is something you find yourself needing to share it with someone who still thinks the removal only took land. Because what was in those caves was the tradition's safeguard against exactly the kind of loss the removal caused. The people who carved the marks understood that human memory fails and walls do not. They were right about the walls. The walls are still there.